This week we are taking another stop on a tour around the world. And this week's stop is Iran, which I have a personal connection to. And I'm sitting at an odd angle, so it looks like I don't know, I don't know what it looks like. The screen looks kind of weird. But before I get into that, there were a couple of things I wanted to talk about. The first is spring break is next week, right?
Yes.
All right. It looks like it's all week long, so we're not going to have a meeting. I know that's really devastating to some people. And I will keep adding modules, but nothing will be due next week. So everybody can take a break from that as well. Hopefully get caught up on different stuff. The other thing is I did add something a little bit late today, and I wanted to get your take on it. I added something that is it's for the artist research project that we've been working on, a couple of the modules we've done. And I'm wondering, I just put it online today, and I'm wondering if instead of making it due this Sunday, I should make it due the following Sunday. Give people, and unfortunately, it does mean doing it over spring break, but it also means giving it an extra week. What are your thoughts?
I'd prefer to have it due this week just to kind of get it over with.
Okay, all right. It shouldn't take you more than about an hour and a half, 2 hours if you take a long time writing. And you're going to be writing 2 paragraphs about each of the 3 sources. Or I'm sorry, you're going to pick 3 sources out of the 10 that you came up with in module 6, and you're going to write 2 paragraphs about each of those 3 sources. So with editing and double checking for grammar and punctuation and everything, I'm thinking 2 or 3 hours tops. So I will do that. And so nothing will be due next week. I'll make that a note. All right, excellent. How is everything going on with you?
Good.
Excellent. Did you have a good week last week?
Very busy with midterms.
Well, and I'm glad you said that because that's one of the things that I think it horrified me when I was going to school. And so that's why we don't have an official midterm. I just have to enter the grades that have been turned in up to them. I think you guys have enough stress and stuff to deal with without me adding to that pile. Unless you really want me to.
I'm good.
Okay. At least they're out of the way and you can move on to spring break. Oh, after I'm just going to give my little bit of a story about my relationship with Iran. You know, right now, what's going on in Iran, there's some really heartbreaking things that are happening. And I think that after the dust settles, we're going to see quite a bit different and ideally more hopeful country. But several years ago, I don't know if you're probably not old enough to remember when 9/11 happened, when 23 people attacked the U.S. and ran airplanes into the Twin Towers and a couple other places around the country. And they did it, and they killed 3,000 people, but they did it in the name of a religion. And the entire country, all of the U.S. just about thought that all Muslims were evil and all of them had to die. Thankfully, that has changed. But sad to say, I'm one of those people who felt that Islam was truly evil at that time as well. And this is September in 2001. So thankfully, I started trying to find out. Usually, when things are we're afraid of things, uh, a big time reaction is to be angry at the thing that we're afraid of, try to show that we're not scared of it anymore. Excuse me, I'm gonna move this so I don't. All right. That still looks, I look really distorted and weird, and I don't know exactly why. Hold on a second. Let's see if that helps. Okay, is that a little bit better?
Right now
And
it's just blurry for me.
what's that?
It's just blurry,
Oh,
but
the camera's blurry.
I think it's just the connection.
Okay, I hope so. Uh, Thankfully, I had some good people around me at that time, and instead of staying in that idea of hatred towards everything Muslim, I started trying to find out about Islam. And within a few years, I had started learning enough that I made a series of sculptures. Now, I'm not Muslim. I am, as far as religion goes, I do classify myself as Christian. But when I started doing art that had these kind of Islamic themes to them, I read a lot of Iranian philosophers, or Persia is another name for the country of Iran. Read a lot of Persian philosophers, found out they were absolutely brilliant, studied a lot of Persian art, and the work that I was doing at that time, I was just trying as much as I could to be honest and respectful. Remember, we spoke about appropriating imagery from other cultures. And do you remember one of the things we talked about when we were talking about that? When you take art from other cultures, what do you need to do?
I forgot.
Well, you need to approach it with respect and learn the context. And so that's what I was trying to do. And I contacted Muslim groups and talked to them. And I learned about a lot of different things. And I started posting the art online. And a few years later, several years later, a couple universities in Iran came across my art and then invited me to go to Iran and study Islamic art and philosophy. So I actually got to go to Iran in 2017 and study about a semester's worth of work in all sorts of different arts and uh, philosophy as well, Islamic philosophy. That was absolutely mind blowing. A lot of the times when we think, and tell me, Addison, if this is true for you too, when we think about Iran, we think about subjugation of women, we think about systemic ignorance, and we think about deplorable living conditions. Does that seem to be about true from what you expect to see on the media?
Yes.
Yeah, and that's what I thought too when I went. It was just it was a lifetime opportunity, and I thought there's no way I'm going to pass it up. When I got there, it was astonishing to me because the reality was very different from that which I expected. Um, what we don't realize is that Persia has been a bastion or a citadel of intellect and reason for hundreds and hundreds of years. Do you know who the poet Rumi is?
No.
Okay, well, after this, look him up. Rumi. He is the most in North America, and this is still true, which is kind of funny. In North America, he is the most selling poet. So he is still the most popular poet in North America, even though he's been dead for 700 years. Can you believe that?
That's quite impressive.
But he was born in Iran, and he lived for quite a while in Turkey, and so both of those countries, a lot of what students grow up learning is from what Rumi wrote. Today, our ideas about setting up museums how we do studies in sociology, even math, like the words for algorithm and well, the word for algorithm and also the word for gibberish. Um, all those things have their roots in Persian culture. Gibberish, there's a gentleman named Al-Jabbar, who's again about 700 years ago, who was a super genius, and he wrote a series of books talking about the natural sciences, but many of them were completely indecipherable. And since his name was Al-Jabbar, that's where we got the word gibberish from. Then a few years ago at the Harvard Library, a student had designed a project to digitize all of Al-Jabbar's books and found out that the reason no one could understand them is that things were out of order. And as soon as you put them in order, people could understand. But so, that's a side note showing that we get a lot of words from Persia. But how, like I said, sciences, natural sciences, how we look at the universe, geometry and math, a lot of those things either have their roots in the work of Persian scholars centuries ago, or in large part were defined by the works of Persian scholars. Now, do you know what the primary religion in Iran is?
Islamic?
That's right, Islam. And there are a number of things that we kind of touch on a little bit about Islam in this module that I think people might be a little bit surprising. Remember, I mentioned that Islam, throughout much of its history, was the most literate religion until about 1798. And one of the reasons is that in the Quran, which is the the principal scripture for Islam, it says that the Quran must be written in your heart. And so that meant boys and girls from a very young age started to learn how to read. And in most Islamic countries, until about 200 years ago, the average kid, up until they're about 10, 11, 12 years old, could memorize the entire Quran and recite. If somebody could, stop them on the street and gave them a chapter, they could recite the entire chapter without any preparation. So, incredibly, if you can imagine what that kind of education would do for kids, really, really smart people. And until the 1950s, um, Iran was very progressive in the application of democracy, the rights to vote for both men and women, and even had women in elected leadership roles quite a bit. And that kind of dissipated when the Shah took over. But you can imagine, with a lot of really smart people, lots of math, just creating religious buildings, there has been some just amazing art and architecture to show up in Iran. Some of the things that might surprise people is that Islam, well, the principal language of Islam is Arabic, and it has the same roots as Hebrew. They're both Semitic languages. And the word for God in Islam is Allah, which is in Aramaic is the same word that Jesus used in the last prayer he uttered to call to God, which was Eloi, is what he said. And so Jesus essentially prayed using the same word for God that Muslims do today. Islam, the word Islam means the path of peace, the path of peace or the path of obedience to the divine will. And a Muslim in Arabic means someone who follows the path of peace or who follows the divine will and is obedient. That kind of surprises a lot of people. Um, and we can see that in a lot of the developing world, women's rights are particularly curtailed. And we see in the West, when you see the Muslim hair covering for women, what do you think is the most common response of a Westerner when they see that?
That they're forced to wear it.
Yeah, that's the most common thing. When the Prophet Muhammad was alive, we're talking about 610, 620, so over 1400 years ago. At that time in the Arabian Peninsula, women were barely considered human. Uh, Families, if they had a choice to feed the horse or the girls, they would choose to feed the horse. And it was completely fine at that time around Mecca for a family who didn't like their girls or thought they were a waste of resources. Up until the age of 14, a family could take a young lady out into the desert and bury her alive, and then tell anybody who questioned about it that she was stillborn. Can you believe that? Up until 14, that completely blows me away. When the Prophet Muhammad started receiving the Quran and writing and reciting it, he never learned to read or write. That Quran was only recited to people who wrote it down. He, his wife, he felt was an incredibly remarkable woman. She was a self-made businesswoman who was a success. She owned a number of different companies, including essentially shipping companies or caravans that would carry goods to and from China and had connections to North Africa. And she knew several languages. She was just a brilliant polymath. And the Prophet Muhammad started looking around and he saw what the Jews and Christians have been doing. And the birth of the hijab actually means virtuous. So somebody who wears the hijab is somebody who is virtuous. And the Prophet instituted the idea of women wearing the hijab in order to force men to look at her in the face and to look at her eyes and recognize her humanity. So that's the actual history of the hijab, but it's completely different than what we were told, isn't it?
Yes.
But the Prophet Muhammad did not invent it at all. He actually borrowed it from the Jews had used it earlier, and then the Christians had picked it up from the Jews. Did you know that?
From the notes I did.
Can you think of any group of Christians today who still wear the hijab?
No.
Have you ever seen a nun?
Yeah.
Yeah, nuns wear hijabs, and that's where the Prophet Muhammad got it from. So, as you learn about these kinds of things, it's kind of fun because you see that what we learn from social media and other things is completely different than what the reality is. Now, there's a couple little videos that I'd like you to, a couple things I'd want you to check out in the that first section where it talks about Iran. I'm not going to say that Iran is absolutely perfect, but I will say that it is very different than what we expect. There are Jewish and Christian congregations in Tehran. They have one of the oldest Christian buildings in the world there in Tehran. And there is a very ancient Christian population in Iran. And it's the way that women are treated. Did see some things that kind of made me wonder a bit. But what I found out very quickly is first, if you ever go driving in Iran, I would suggest hiring a native driver because nobody bothers following the traffic lights or anything like that. Nobody cares. However, if you want to get across a busy street into downtown Tehran and you're waiting and waiting and waiting for a little area to open up, just find a little old lady wearing a chowda, and a chowda is like a hijab and a blanket wrapped up into one. She covers her clothes with it, and she will doesn't even have to look. She'll just go into traffic, and every driver will stop for her. She could set up a lemonade stand and sell lemonade from a crosswalk in the middle of a busy Tehran street, and nobody would even honk their horn. And a big part of that is because of how um, many people are trained. Many young men are trained to treat their mothers. It's quite a bit different than what we, I think, in the West expect. While I was there, I worked with people who were calligraphers and bookbinders. I worked with people who were traditional painters, um, and other things as well. When you think about Islamic art, do you think very much of things like figurative work, where you see animals and birds and people, or do you think mostly of design work or calligraphy?
Design work.
Yeah, we think of design work. And a lot of the times we think, oh, Muslims aren't allowed to show people or animals. And actually, there was a group of Islamic scholars, and they're kind of categorized under the name Wahhabist, that felt that that was the appropriate way to go. In the Quran, it says that no one should ever worship an icon or a painting. And the Prophet Muhammad did not want anybody to do his portrait because he didn't want anybody to have an image of him anywhere in their house or the worship space. And he didn't want anybody to even have a hint of thinking that he was anything other than a human being. As he said, the only object of worship should be God, and there should not be anything made that people look at and eventually view as being an icon or an image to be worshipped rather than God. But that does not mean that the human form doesn't show up in Islamic art, and it doesn't mean that there's no birds or animals. Um, in India, there's an art form called miniature painting that was very, very detailed, small paintings in books that were made for royalty. And when that kind of art style came to Persia, uh, Persian artists just exploded. They thought it was wonderful. And so you see an awful lot of miniature paintings of humans and scenes and stuff like that in Iran, and even in books, storybooks and stuff. I went to a number of museums and saw this. So there is a lot of that, but you will never see somebody painting somebody they claim to be God or somebody painting the Prophet Muhammad. You may see his form, but there's always going to be a cloth covering his face because nobody will paint his face. However, a friend of mine, his name is Dr. Ahmed Safi, Omid Safi. He was, until a little while ago, the head of the Islamic studies at Duke University. He gives a couple lectures online about the human form in Islamic art. So it's not something that is wrong for people to paint, but it's something that you don't see very often. And when I was in Tehran, I met with the artist who was considered the best artist in all of Iran in doing miniature paintings. And so he painted animals and birds and things like that quite a bit. So, but it's not something that we think of, is it? Definitely not something that we think of. And you're right, calligraphy is absolutely huge. Another thing that is gigantic is uh, pattern making. A lot of lacy patterns and a lot of patterns with stylized floral forms The name for that is vegetal, Vegetal. That describes the kind of abstracted floral forms where you see all the interlacing and everything. One thing that I think is fascinating is that there is a particular um, motif that I saw in several mosques, and it's usually in the walls um, down low on the first level, where the design is basically two five-pointed stars laid over each other. So you see a total of 10 points. And the geometric designs and floral designs radiate out from that. What is interesting to me is that that is the same radial geometry that you see when you look down a DNA helix. And this has been a staple of Iranian art since about the 12th or 13th century. And can you guess what that 10-pointed design style or motif is called?
No.
No, but this is the thing that's interesting to me. Um, it is the same as the molecular helix of DNA, and that design style is called the tree of life. So I thought that was kind of cool. Now, in the section called Art and Architecture of Iranian mosques or Islamic mosques, we talk a little bit about something called semiotics. Semiotic. Semiotics is basically uh, the idea that we can get some meaning about how people live their lives by the buildings that they construct. And you can kind of understand that. You go to a house that has a really big kitchen and a big living room, and then the bedrooms are kind of small. What does that tell you about the priorities of the family?
I don't know.
Well, if the bedrooms are kind of small and the living room or kitchen are really big, then that generally means that the families really value together time. And so that's what the idea of meaning in architecture revolves around. When we look at a religious building, a lot of the times for the biblical religions, and there's four biblical religions, that's Jewish, Sabbatean, Christian, and Islamic. Those are the four, or Islam. Those are the four Old Testament or biblical religions. Generally, there's going to be a base which represents the cube or the limited structure of the earth, and there's going to be something that hits at a dome, either a real dome or arches at the top, and that hints at the limitlessness of the heavens or the star-filled sky. And you can really see that a lot in Islamic architecture with the domes and all that kind of thing. But do you know which religion inspired Islamic architecture the most?
No.
This actually comes from my friend at Duke University. He said that the Christians started working with this style, the dome on top of basically a cube, uh, before Muslim architecture really established itself. And when the Muslim architects started seeing what the Byzantine Christians were doing, they were blown away. And so what we think of today as Islamic architecture, Dr. Ahmed Safi says, is actually based on early Christian architecture. And they just loved it. I thought that was kind of cool. But if we think of things in that space where we think of a dome as reaching into heaven, we see a lot of these mosques that are like that. Then that really tells us that when you come into a worship space with this huge dome, our hearts should be more set on heaven or the heavens as opposed to the rigid structures around us. Oh, an interesting side note too. I don't know if it's interesting to you, but I thought it was fascinating. the earliest mosques that were first built when Islam became identified as a religion, and they were talking about 630 to 690. One of the reasons why um, the holy day for Islam is on Fridays may very well be because of this. The Prophet Muhammad built mosques so that every faith could have a place to worship. Christians would be there on Sundays, Jews would be there on Saturdays, and Muslims would be there on Fridays. And then they could use it as a town hall gathering place for the rest of the week. I thought that was pretty interesting. And I share a little story about my experience with the Sheikh Lafala Mosque as well. But one thing that's really fascinating to me is if you look at this artwork on some of these images, it just looks absurdly complicated. I mean, it looks like there's absolutely no way you could understand it. However, a lot of this decoration is designed using geometry and math, and talk a little bit more about that, with the idea that if you make a relatively simple design, but you do it in a shape that can be copied, then when all those copies are put together, you can make something that looks incredibly complicated when originally it wasn't. And that process is called tessellation. You need to know about math and geometry in order to figure that stuff out. And we do talk a little bit about math and geometry and their importance in this module. But the big thing is when you go to the Studio Magic Tessellations, what is really fun is that there's a program there that will actually help you to make the tessellations. And when you do that, you just need to make the screenshots. But it kind of shows you that using math and using geometry, you can make things that look incredibly complicated. One of the reasons why math and science and geometry were so important to the Islamic world among Muslims was because the Islamic worldview was really rooted in science and close observation of the natural world. A lot of how we think of science today, you can see its roots on things that our Muslim predecessors wrote about. What is fascinating to me is that it wasn't just Islam that they wrote about either. They kept a lot of earlier records from other people, and they would keep those books safe as well. And I was told by an American history expert, so I don't know what the references were for this, but he said that a lot of the information that the founding fathers of the United States used to come up with the Constitution and the wording for the Declaration of Independence came from books like the Bible, and the writings of Marcus Aurelius and earlier philosophers. But a lot of those books, the reason why they had access to them then and why we have them today is because Muslim scholars took them seriously, and then kept them preserved until they were able to open more or greater relations with the West, so that we would have a broader view of a lot of these writings. So there are a couple Muslim mathematicians and stuff to read about. It's very brief reading. You don't need to worry an awful lot about it. It just kind of sets up the idea for these tessellations. In Islamic thought, one of the reasons why people would do these organic vegetal motifs was because they wanted to communicate the idea that things just grow amazingly well in heaven. And the plant motifs became a symbol for the fertility that exists within heaven. And which is really important as a symbol. If you're talking about a culture, the religion was born in the Arabian Peninsula, which is one of the largest inhabited areas on the planet that doesn't have a body of water that has water in it all year round. I mean, it's incredibly deserty. Things like wells and springs are vitally important and were reasons why wars were fought for a long time. And so anything that if you're trying to describe heaven to somebody and they live in a desert, ideas about plant life growing out of control seems like a pretty good idea for a symbol for heaven. But then math was used as well to develop these geometric designs that could be copied and repeated to make the design look like it went into infinity. And one of the reasons perhaps for this kind of design idea, this kind of interlacing incredibly complicated design, is to communicate the idea that there is an infinity to the universe. The designs can go on forever, but each little element is vital. And then that becomes, of course, a symbol for the human relationship to the universe. Each person, we may not understand what the pattern is, but each person is incredibly important to the universe as a whole. So that's one idea as to why the art is the way it is. And when you go to that studio magic tessellations exercise, we talk a little bit more about tessellations and the geometry, but don't worry, you do not need to know any math or any geometry. What you need to do is just go to the Qatar Foundation International's online tile maker website and just follow the directions. Play around a little bit. And then after you've played around with it for a bit, the assignment is to come up with 5 tessellations. And before you click done for each of these 5, you're going to click the button that says preview. That will show you what your tessellation looks like. And I want you to take a screenshot of that. And this is not going to take very long. You may even want to do this, 6, 7, 8, 10 times, and then just turn in the 5 preview shots of your best designs. And that's pretty much all you have to do. And I think one of the reasons why Islam is or Iran is used is that kind of becomes Iran and Turkey were 2 of the countries that really informed a lot of the art of the Islamic world. And so by focusing on Persia, we are in essence covering a lot of territory because they influenced even artists into Africa. And they're still influencing artists around the world today into Africa and India, both. So that I think is a pretty worthwhile stop for our world tour. Now, the other thing that I need to talk about for this module is the artist research. Do you remember in Module 3 and Module 6? In Module 3, everybody needed to pick an artist out of that list to do more research on and explain why you like them. And then in Module 6, I had everybody make a list of 10 different resources that you could go to learn more about the artist. Do you remember both of those?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, this time we're going to do an annotated bibliography. Now, what's the difference between a bibliography and a biography?
I honestly forgot.
Okay, bio means life and biblio means book. So biography is the life story of somebody, which I do not want any of you to do. Please. And a bibliography is a list. It means literally a book list. And annotation means that you write something about it. So we're going to do write a bibliography, and for each of the sources in the bibliography, you're going to write a paragraph that talks about the source, and then you're going to write a paragraph that shares what you think about the source, what you learned. Now, even though I had you look at 10 different sources in Module 6, I only want you to pick 3 of the best ones to write to use for your annotated bibliography. So that's just 3 sources. That's why I said it shouldn't take more than a couple hours. Because all you got to do is watch a couple videos that talk about how to use MLA format to write your citation. And a citation is so that absolutely anybody can go back and find what you found again. And let's see. And then you're going to write 2 paragraphs, and I talk about that. The first paragraph is going to be just recapping what you saw in your source, if it was a video, or what you read, if it was an article online. And then you're going to reflect on it a bit. You're going to write a second paragraph that talks about your thoughts regarding what you learned in that source. So how many different sources do you need for your bibliography?
3.
3. And what does the annotation mean?
I forgot.
Annotation is the same word, comes from the same word for notes. So annotation just means you write notes about it. So again, that's 2 paragraphs. The first one is going to be a summary of what you saw in that citation. And the second paragraph is going to be what you think about it. And on this one, I gave an example. And the example that I gave has to do with an actual exhibit. And so I followed the MLA format for that citation. And then I wrote 2 paragraphs. One is talks about what it was. It was an exhibition catalog. I talk about what I learned about that. And then the second paragraph is I kind of talk a little bit about what I thought about it. Al Farrow is the artist that I picked. He used a lot of imagery with bullets and things like that. And he makes these things that look almost like Catholic reliquaries. And so it's a really interesting combination of stuff. Now, one thing, I am going to have to go back and add this in again, but what's very important is for each citation that you find only online, which is probably going to be all of them, immediately after the citation, you're going to write accessed on and the date. The reason why that's so important is because we've just seen this semester, a couple of the web links that I gave people no longer work, and we had to come up with alternative ones. But if we used, there's a couple sites online that help us to look at what the website was on a specific date. So even if nobody can see the blog post or video that we accessed anymore, if we write next to it accessed on and the date, then that tells them that they can go and use one of these Wayback Machines and find what was actually available on the internet at that date. So I will go back and edit these to remind people to put that in. But like I said, I give an example so you can see that, and there's 3 different videos that walk you through the process. But also, you can call the Utah Tech Writing Lab, and I even give the link to it there. They really know this stuff backwards and forwards, and they are more than, their whole job is to help students to write these. So you could call them, make an appointment, show them what your sources are, and they will walk you through it, the whole thing. If you I would look at the videos first, see if you can figure it out yourself first. And if you can't, then I would call them and see what kind of additional help that they can give you. All right. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Excellent. All right. Well, that's great. That's all I have. Do you have any questions or anything?
No, I do not.
Okay. Do you have any fun plans that are legal for spring break?
I am working all of spring break, so
You know what? So am I. That's awesome. We'll be work buddies.
yeah.
It'd be so nice to be able to do something else, but oh well. I guess I don't know. I guess some of us like to eat. Sigh. Well, I hope you have a good weekend and week anyway. If you do have any questions about the assignments, go through, look up that link for the Utah Tech Writing Lab and see if they can help you. And if you still have questions, then feel free to email me and I will do my best to answer. All right?
Yep.
Excellent. All right, we'll see you not next week, but the following week, okay?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. You have a good weekend.
You too. Bye.
Bye.